So thank you. First of all, thank you very much for having me. I think this is probably the third year we've tried to get this to happen. So I'm glad we've been able to make this happen. So the session is keys to successful podcasting. And really what I want to share is our experience as an audio production company in how we've managed to help a lot of brands create successful podcasts, and also some of the errors that we've learned along the way. So this is a really transparent, really open session, and being able to share with you some of the things that from creating a podcast, which essentially is a tool as part of your marketing mix, part of your content strategy, using the tool of podcasting to its best effect. And one of the things that I don't want to focus on are those vanity metrics of likes and follows and listens and so on. Those are on the other end of the product. And to be honest, 1,000 likes or 1,000 listens for a podcast, which is about a very specific topic, might be more impactful than 1 million on something that's a bit more general. So I'm not so worried about the vanity metrics, the numbers on the other side, but it's really the success in establishing your podcast and making your podcast something that keeps going for season after season after season. A little bit about Unedited so that you know where we're coming from. Unedited started in 2017. Myself and a couple of friends were essentially guns for hire. We knew how to work audio. We knew how to edit. We knew how to record. And people were starting this whole podcast thing. So we just helped people make their podcasts. And then someone said to us, now you've made the podcast, what do I do with it? So we created the podcast network, Unedited Stories. And since then, we've gone on to work with all the platforms from BBC to Audible to Spotify to Amazon Music and so on. So we're comfortable in doing what we do, but we've learned a lot along the way. And what we've learned specifically for people who are trying to start a podcast, the first thing you'll notice is you'll type in the name of the podcast that you want to start, and then recognize that in 2017, someone has done that same thing with a podcast, but has only got 2 or 3 episodes. And for me, that's where the success falls over. You want a podcast that's going to be able to deliver and deliver and deliver season after season, even if it's around topical stuff per season. You want something that's going to return season after season. This podcast graveyard that we call it, those 2-3 episode podcasts are out there. There are about 150 million podcast episodes out there right now. And so when you start thinking about podcasts, don't think about your podcast series competing with other people's podcast series. You've got to think about it as your podcast episode competing with other episodes. And there are 150 million other episodes that you're competing with. The podcast graveyard is big as well. About 40 to 45% of podcasts only have 3 episodes. So between 1 and 3 episodes, 40% of all the podcasts that are out there only have 3 episodes. So it's an easy thing to not quite get quite right. So hopefully some things that I share with you will be able to help us get some more effective podcasts for the work that we want to do in the world. So there are 5 things that I want you to consider before starting your podcast. We can talk about, if you've already got a podcast, we can talk about that later in the questions, or you can take me out for lunch. I always do a free lunch with somebody. Take me out for lunch. You can ask me all the questions you want. I won't charge a consultancy fee. But if you're thinking of starting a podcast or rethinking your podcast, here are the 5 things I think you should bear in mind. 1, it's got to be useful. It has to be useful. Whether you're informing, whether you're educating, whether you're entertaining, it has to be something that if someone is going to spend 30 minutes of their time or an hour of their time with you, you've got to give them something that matters to them. And the example that I use is we all had ovens, we all had microwaves, and then air fryers came out. And for some reason, we discovered that air fryers were really, really useful to us. So just because something exists in a similar form, ovens existed, a microwave existed, if you could find out what's useful about an air fryer and your podcast being the air fryer, then you've got something that wins. But the way to think about it is someone is going to invest 30 minutes of their life sitting with me in the podcast. What do I want them to go away feeling? What do I want them to go away knowing? What do I want them to go away experiencing that's going to be really helpful to their lives? Some of the most simplest formats have been the best podcasts. Audiobooks really work because it's literally taking information and putting it into a different form so people don't have to read it. The Rosary podcast, which is literally just a couple of ladies saying the Rosary, is a massive podcast. And for most people, they've never heard of it. So if you can make it useful to people's day to day, if you can make it useful to people's work, play, leisure, you're onto something, especially if you can make it useful to their spirituality. Second thing to bear in mind is to make it unique. And it's challenging for people to make things unique now because it seems like everything has been done. But we have an example that we use when we're working with people and brainstorming is the bread and water example. Bread and water are the staple things. Like the most broke people have access to bread and water. So here's what we say. Let's go to a supermarket, look down the bread aisle and look down the water aisle. Ironically, those are probably the largest aisles for a single item in a supermarket. Think about it. Bread and water, that's it. However, bread and water has many variables. There's sliced bread, bread with seeds, bun shaped, half loaves, half and half. You do the same with water. There's even skinny water, if you can believe it. And what they're doing is they're finding something that exists, but finding that unique twist that they can add to it. Do I have a podcast which is similar to someone else's, but mine is a commentary and theirs is the content? Is it something that I can give you a summary of everything else that's happening in half an hour so that you don't have to do that work for yourself? So many things you can do in terms of looking at how unique your podcast is, and then being able to create one line. That's the exercise. Create one line that communicates the uniqueness of your podcast to a point where people go, okay, I get it, and it's not like anything else. Element number 3 is make it reusable. You're going to spend a lot of time creating your podcast. Believe it or not, it may feel like you record a podcast for an hour because that's how long it takes, but actually the planning and the scheduling and the researching means you're probably spending a good part of a day for an hour's podcast. We kind of say if your podcast is an hour, imagine you're going to spend a day from beginning to end. That's 24 hours, not just 8 hours. That's 24 hours to get the best out of your podcast, which means scripting it, editing it, making sure the artwork is fine, the liner notes, the podcast notes. So all of that goes into making a podcast. That will take you about 24 hours per episode. So if you're going to spend that time, how can you reuse some of that content? Are you getting social media clips out of that? Plan that in. Can you transcribe it for a newsletter or just make it available in text? Is it something that you want to transcribe and then re-edit for a book? What about articles? What about taking sections of it and putting it on a website or a blog or even a church magazine? Using that time that you create your podcast as something that's useful and productive for other forms of content is going to help you create the success and momentum around your podcast. So for instance, if there comes a week where you're really struggling to find that motivation or inspiration to get that podcast out, you also have to get other bits of content out. So therefore, it pushes you to get your podcast consistent. And as we just heard, consistency is key. My 4th tip will be to think about this as making it a family. The people that you gather to your podcast are like-minded people, and holding them together in a space is important because they become the reason that you create your podcast every week, every episode, every month, however you do it. And it's got to be a two-way communication. You've got to find ways of being able to communicate with them on the podcast. So whether it's people sending emails in or being able to contribute on the platforms, encouraging people to use the comments box and so on, sharing, etc. But also outside of the podcast. So do you have a newsletter? Do you have a Patreon that they subscribe to? Do you have events that they can show up at? It's really thinking about, I'm creating this podcast for my community. And so how do I help that community grow and sustain? And that in itself impacts the success of the podcast. And then the final thing is, as was talked about by Stats earlier on, is about money. And how do you make your podcast make money? It's important to think about that from the very, very, very start of your podcast. I have a three-line system, and I'm going to just share it briefly here. But I've written a blog on it on LinkedIn in Unedited. We are Unedited's blog space. So if you can follow us on Unedited, We Are Unedited, you'll find the full details there. But podcasting can be lucrative, but there are three ways in which you can make money from podcasting, or three ways in which your podcast can get paid for. One is I pay. I'm making the podcast, I pay for it. I invest in it in myself, and I do it. I go through the upskilling journey. I do the learning curve to edit it and so on. I pay, or I pay other people to do it. Second way of funding your podcast is they pay. The people who listen, the people who are invested in listening to your podcast pay. So that's either through subscriptions or some kind of membership scheme, Patreon. It could also be events and merchandise. So you are selling to the people who are invested or interested in your podcast. The final way is someone else pays. So someone else somewhere, an investor, a sponsor, an advertiser who has an interest in your audience, the people that you're gathering together, will pay for that podcast. Now, you've got to think about how this happens over the lifespan of your podcast. Perhaps in season one, it's an I pay situation, because in season one, you're still growing your audience and trying to find out who exactly is listening to you. But then you might think, well, in season two, I've got enough of an audience to make it worthwhile for a small investor or a small brand or a local business to get involved in the sponsorship. It might not pay for the whole podcast, so there might still be a little bit of I pay and someone else pays. But by season three, when you've got your podcast numbers a lot bigger, people invested in you, you've got returning listeners, then you go, okay, maybe they can pay for it. They find it useful. They can contribute something to it. So those are the kind of 5 things I think are worth thinking about in able to establish a successful podcast. Make it useful, make it unique, make it reusable, make a family out of it, and make it make money. And as I said, if you go to our LinkedIn page, Unedited LinkedIn page, there are lots of articles, including the one about monetizing podcasts. But also there's things about using AI in podcasting and IP and intellectual property. One thing that I always recommend to people is, if you are starting a podcast, you're essentially writing a book. After 10 episodes, you've got enough to transcribe and create a manuscript for a book. So perhaps you've always wanted to write a book and you've never really been able to get off the ground. Think about your topic as a podcast and then speak to 10 different people about that topic. And all of a sudden you've got the basis, including quotes, for your book. So that's me. Hopefully there are some questions, and I'm happy to take questions. As I say, I will talk to anyone for lunch. I like building with people, as we were saying, Bailey was saying, let's grow the community. So I'm open to that. But I'm happy to take any questions while I'm here now, including people who may have started podcasts and have kind of got into a bit of a rut.